we're going to try and unpack the massive, kind of invisible forces that control our jobs, our savings, pretty much our daily lives. So let's dive right in.
Have you ever just stopped and wondered why the economy feels like a total roller coaster? You know, one minute things are booming, jobs are everywhere, and the future looks amazing. And then bam! The next thing you know, all the headlines are screaming about recession and uncertainty. It's this wild cycle of ups and downs that, let's be honest, affects every single one of us.
Well, believe it or not, economists actually have a name for this roller coaster. They call it the business cycle. Think of it as the natural pulse of the economy. It moves through 4 distinct phases. Expansion, that's the good part. A peak, the top of the ride. A recession, the way down. And a trough, the very bottom. Understanding this cycle, well, that's the key to making sense of our entire economic world.
Okay, but to figure out where we are on this ride, we're going to need some instruments, right? Some vital signs for the economy. So how in the world do we actually measure the health of this massive, incredibly complex system?
The number one vital sign, the big one, is gross domestic product, or GDP. You can think of it as the economy's ultimate report card. It's the total dollar value of everything, every car, every coffee, every app produced inside a country over a certain amount of time. It is by far the broadest measure of economic health we've got.
So how do they even calculate a number that huge? Well, the most common way is actually pretty straightforward. They just add up all the spending. That includes C for consumption, that's all the stuff you and I buy, I for investment from businesses, G for government spending, and finally, net exports, which is just the value of what we sell to the rest of the world minus what we buy from them.
Now, you might see a headline that looks absolutely fantastic, something like this: economy booms with 12% GDP growth. I mean, that sounds incredible, right? But maybe hold on a second.
Because the number that actually matters, the one economists are really looking at, might look a lot more like this, just 5%. So what happened? Where did that other 7% just vanish to? This is where the story gets really, really interesting.
The culprit, in one word, is inflation. See, that big nominal GDP number includes price increases, but the smaller and way more important, real GDP number has all that inflation stripped out. So here's the bottom line. Real GDP tells us if we're actually producing more stuff, or if we're just paying more money for the exact same amount of stuff. Big difference.
For a really long time, the general thinking was that we just had to grit our teeth and ride out these economic waves. But then, right in the middle of the Great Depression, an economist named John Maynard Keynes showed up with this absolutely revolutionary idea. Maybe we can actually steer the ship.
You see, before Keynes, classical economists pretty much believed that markets would always, eventually, fix themselves. They figured if there was high unemployment, wages would just fall until everyone got hired again. Simple. But Keynes looked around and saw that wages and prices are sticky. They don't fall that easily in the real world. He argued the problem wasn't a lack of supply, it was a lack of demand. In simple terms, people and businesses just weren't spending enough money to keep the whole system moving.
And this is where his most powerful idea comes into play, the multiplier effect. It's brilliant, really. He argued that if the government steps in and spends money, let's say $1 billion on a project, it doesn't just add $1 billion to the economy. No. That money gets paid to workers and companies. And what do? They spend a chunk of it. And that spending becomes someone else's income, who then spends a chunk of their new income, and this ripple effect just keeps going. That small initial boost can lead to a much, much larger increase in the country's total income. This is why he famously said, "In the long run, we are all dead." Now, he wasn't trying to be gloomy. He was being a realist. His point was, who cares if the market will fix itself in 10 years? We can't just wait around while people are suffering from unemployment right now. We need to act.
So if we can actually steer the economy, what do the controls look like? Well, economists came up with a model that works kind of like a dashboard, showing how the two main policy levers, that's government spending and interest rates, play off of each other.
Okay, the first part of this dashboard looks at the market for actual goods and services. And the idea at its core is super simple. When interest rates go down, it's cheaper for businesses and for you to borrow money. And that, of course, leads to more investment and more spending, which gives the whole economy a boost.
The second part of the dashboard looks at the money supply itself. Think about it. As the economy gets bigger and people's incomes go up, we all need more cash just for our day-to-day transactions. This increased demand for money can actually push interest rates up, which makes borrowing more expensive again. So here's the control panel in action. Policymakers have two main levers they can pull. First, the government can use fiscal policy.
That's things like spending more on infrastructure. This will boost the economy, but it can also push interest rates higher. The other lever is monetary policy, which is controlled by the central bank. They can increase the money supply, which also boosts the economy, but it does so by pushing interest rates down.
But, and this is a big but, there's a catch, especially with that fiscal policy. It's something called the crowding out effect. See, when the government borrows and spends a ton of money, it can drive up interest rates for everybody, making it more expensive for private companies to borrow and invest. So in a way, the public spending can sometimes crowd out private spending, making the whole policy a little less effective than it looks on paper.
Of course, no economy lives in a bubble. The second we start trading and investing with other countries, this whole picture gets a whole lot more complicated. To keep track of it all, countries use a kind of national checkbook called the balance of payments. One part, the current account, keeps tabs on all the goods and services we buy and sell. The other part, the capital account, tracks all the money flowing in and out for investments, everything from buying foreign stocks to building a brand new factory overseas.
Now, what's so fascinating here is how this whole global system completely changes which tool is the most effective. Get this, if a country decides to fix its currency's value to another, government spending, fiscal policy, suddenly becomes its most powerful tool. But if a country lets its currency float freely, like the US dollar does, then monetary policy, messing with interest rates, becomes the absolute powerhouse for steering the economy.
So, okay, we've talked business cycles, GDP, Keynes, global economics. That is a lot of theory. But let's get down to it. Why does any of this actually matter to you? Because this stuff isn't just theory. These are the invisible forces shaping your financial life. When the central bank decides to adjust monetary policy, that directly affects the interest rate on your mortgage or your car loan. When the government uses fiscal policy, that can literally determine how healthy the job market is when you're looking for work. These concepts are the blueprint for pretty much every major economic decision that gets made, especially during a crisis. Which really brings us to our final and maybe most important question. If we have this sophisticated dashboard, and we have these incredibly powerful controls to steer the economy, then why do we still have crashes, recessions, and financial crises? That right there is the puzzle at the very heart of modern economics, and it's definitely a question worth thinking about.